The Clarity Gap by Wealthy Mindset Audiobooks. Most people who feel confused about money in their 30s are not confused because they know too little. They are confused because they have been solving the wrong problem for a very long time. The anxiety is real, but its source is almost never where it appears to be. Beneath the surface of every financial frustration that refuses to resolve itself, there is not a gap in knowledge, there is a gap in structure. And once that distinction becomes clear, something that has felt permanently uncertain begins, for the first time, to feel quietly and completely solvable. There is a particular kind of financial discomfort that doesn't arrive with sirens. It doesn't announce itself as crisis, and it rarely looks like failure from the outside. It arrives quietly, the way a low hum does, present enough to notice, subtle enough to ignore, and persistent enough that after a while, you stop asking where it's coming from. If you are somewhere in your 30s and you have done most of what you were supposed to do, built a career, earned a reasonable income, managed your obligations with reasonable consistency, and yet money still produces a tension in you that no raise has fully resolved, then you already know this hum. You've been living alongside it, perhaps for years, without quite knowing what to call it. And that namelessness is part of what makes it so exhausting to carry. Because when something is unnamed, the mind fills the silence with its own explanations. And the explanations the mind reaches for are rarely generous. You begin to suspect the discomfort reflects something about your character, that you are careless, perhaps, or undisciplined, or simply not wired the way people who are good with money seem to be wired. You observe others around you who speak about finances with ease, who seem to have made decisions that compounded quietly into stability, and something in you compares, not loudly, not consciously, most of the time, but the comparison happens and it leaves a residue, a quiet question that resurfaces at the end of most months, in the pause after checking a balance or reconsidering a plan. Why haven't I gotten further with this? The frustration, when you examine it honestly, doesn't live in any single place. It lives in the gap, the space between what you earn and what you feel, between what you know and how you act, between where you are and where, somewhere in the background of your expectations, you always assumed you would be by now. It is the frustration of effort that doesn't seem to compound, of intention that keeps resetting, of a financial life that functions, more or less, but never quite coheres into something that feels solid and purposeful and yours. You have not been passive about this. That is worth acknowledging. You have read the articles, listened to the conversations, downloaded the frameworks, absorbed the vocabulary. You can speak fluently about the importance of saving early, about the principle of spending less than you earn, about the quiet power of compounding over time. You have nodded at this content, recognized its logic, even felt momentarily inspired by it. And then, at the end of the month, the feeling returns, unresolved, unshifted, like a sentence that keeps starting over without ever arriving at its point. This is the paradox that sits at the center of your confusion, and it is worth stating plainly. You are more financially literate than most people who have ever lived. The information available to you today, free, abundant, sophisticated, would have been unimaginable to previous generations. And yet, here you are, more anxious about money than you expected to be at this stage of your life, more uncertain, more aware of the gap between knowledge and ease than you would like to admit. If literacy were the answer, you would already have the answer. The fact that you don't suggests something important, that literacy and clarity are not the same thing, and that you have been pursuing one while needing the other. Something in you already suspects this. There is a quiet intuition, one you may not have fully articulated, that the next tip will not resolve this, that the next system, the next conversation with someone who seems to have it together, The next moment of inspiration will produce the same temporary lift followed by the same return to uncertainty, that the problem is deeper than any of those things can reach. You haven't been able to name what that something deeper is, but you've felt its outline, the shape of a problem that keeps resisting the solutions you've been offering it. And so, over time, the suspicion has turned inward. You have begun to wonder, in those quiet moments of honest self-assessment, whether the confusion is evidence of something unflattering, whether it reflects a carelessness you don't quite see in yourself, or an immaturity you should have outgrown, or some fundamental misalignment between who you are and who you need to be to get this right. That suspicion deserves a direct response, because it is both understandable and entirely mistaken. The confusion is not a character flaw. It is a structural signal, and the difference between those two things, between a problem of identity and a problem of architecture, is not a minor distinction. It is, in fact, the entire distance between continuing to drift and finally beginning to build. Because a flaw in your character has no clean solution. But a flaw in a foundation can be addressed piece by piece, with patience and clarity and the right understanding of what was actually missing. What was missing was never information. What was missing was the structure within which information becomes meaningful. And that is a very different problem, one that, once named, becomes surprisingly possible to solve. When something in our lives isn't working, the first instinct is almost always to learn more about it. This response is so natural, so deeply wired into how capable people approach problems that it rarely gets questioned. You feel uncertain about money, so you seek out better understanding of money. You feel behind, so you study what being ahead looks like. You feel confused, so you reach for clarity in the form of content, a book, a video, a podcast, a framework that someone else has assembled and is generously offering to share. The logic is clean, the intention is genuine, and the result, more often than not, is a temporary relief that fades before it ever becomes anything permanent. This is the misdiagnosis, and it is worth examining carefully, because it is not a mistake made by careless people. It is a mistake made almost exclusively by thoughtful ones. The assumption underneath all that information seeking is subtle but significant, that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is a knowledge gap, that somewhere out there is a concept you haven't encountered yet, an insight that hasn't quite landed, a piece of the puzzle that once found will cause everything else to click into place. This assumption is so intuitive that most people never stop to question it. It feels like intellectual responsibility. It feels like doing the work. And because it feels productive, it becomes the default response to every new wave of financial uncertainty, which means it becomes a loop, cycling through the same motion without ever arriving at a different destination. Consider what this loop actually looks like from the inset. You encounter a period of financial unease. You respond by consuming, reading, listening, absorbing. Something resonates. You feel a temporary clarity, a sense that now you understand what you need to do. That feeling is real, and it is not nothing. But understanding what to do and having a structure that ensures it gets done are separated by a distance that motivation alone cannot reliably cross. Days pass, the clarity softens, the old patterns reassert themselves, and eventually the unease returns, slightly heavier this time, because now it carries the additional weight of having tried and still arrived back at the same place. There is a useful analogy here. Imagine someone who has spent years reading about architecture. They understand the principles deeply: load-bearing walls, foundation depth, the way materials behave under different kinds of pressure. They can walk through a well-designed building and identify everything that makes it work. They can speak about structural integrity with genuine fluency. And yet, for all of that knowledge, they have never actually built anything to live in. Their understanding of architecture is real. Their shelter is not. The knowledge, however sophisticated, has not produced the thing the knowledge was supposed to be about. Financial life works precisely this way, and the gap between knowing about money and having built a coherent structure around it is where most financially intelligent people are quietly living, not in ignorance, but in the uncomfortable space between understanding and construction. The hidden cost of this misdiagnosis is not simply wasted time, though time is certainly lost. The deeper cost is what repeated failure of a trusted strategy does to confidence. When you do what should work, when you engage seriously, consume thoughtfully, apply yourself with genuine intention, and the result is still the same restless uncertainty, something begins to shift in how you interpret the experience. Not loudly, not all at once, but gradually, each cycle of learn and return quietly reinforces the suspicion that the problem is you, that you are somehow not applying things correctly, not disciplined enough, not built for this in some way that others are. The strategy never gets questioned because the strategy feels like diligence. So the blame lands, by default, on the person executing it. This is where the real damage accumulates, not in any single failed attempt, but in the slow, compounding erosion of self-trust that comes from doing the right-seeming thing and arriving, repeatedly, at the wrong result. As Morgan Housel once observed, the most important financial decisions aren't about spreadsheets. They're about behavior. And behavior is shaped not by what you know, but by the environment and structure within which your decisions are made. The shift that matters, then, is not finding better information. It is recognizing that information was never the missing variable. The missing variable was always structure, the deliberate architecture within which knowledge becomes behavior, and behavior becomes outcome. Once you see that the loop was never a failure of intelligence or discipline, but a failure of diagnosis, something important becomes available. Not a solution, not yet, but something that must come before any solution can hold. An accurate understanding of what the problem actually is, and an accurate diagnosis, even before a single thing has changed, already changes something. Now that we have established what the problem is not a knowledge gap, not a failure of effort, not a flaw in your character, it becomes possible to look clearly at what it actually is. And what it actually is tends to be quieter, more invisible, and more structural than most people expect. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't produce obvious failure. It operates beneath the surface of a life that, from the outside, looks entirely functional. And that invisibility is precisely what allows it to persist for so long without being named. The true root of financial confusion at this stage of life is not ignorance. It is the absence of architecture. By architecture, the meaning is specific, not a budget, not a savings target, not a general intention to be more responsible with money. Architecture means a coherent, deliberate structure, one where each financial decision exists in relationship to all the others, where each choice has a place within a larger design, and where the overall shape of that design reflects something intentional rather than something improvised. Without this, even the most thoughtful individual decisions float free of one another. They are made well, in isolation, and they go nowhere in particular, together. This is the invisible pattern, and it compounds in the most deceptive way possible, not through obvious mistakes, but through the accumulation of reasonable ones. You make a considered purchase. You negotiate a sensible trade-off. You weigh the options on a significant financial decision and choose the most practical one. Each of these moments, examined individually, reflects genuine care and intelligence. And yet, if there is no architecture connecting them, no underlying framework within which each decision plays a defined role, then the sum of all that careful thinking is simply motion. Busy, earnest, well-intentioned motion, arriving nowhere specific. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to see is that intelligence doesn't protect against it. In fact, intelligence often makes it harder to detect. A capable person can construct a rational justification for almost any individual decision. They can explain why this purchase made sense right now, why that investment was reasonable given the circumstances, why this trade-off was the responsible choice at the time. The reasoning is usually sound. The problem is not the individual reasoning. It is the absence of a structure that would make certain decisions unnecessary in the first place, that would answer certain questions before they even arise, that would render the improvisation obsolete. And so, the pattern disguises itself as thoughtfulness. It feels like engagement. You are not sleepwalking through your finances. You are actively managing them, responding to them, making considered choices within them. The activity level is real. The productivity is real. But beneath it, there is no architecture. There is only a series of responses to circumstances dressed in the language of decision-making, which over time hardens into a kind of permanent improvisation. Seneca, writing nearly 2,000 years ago, captured something that still applies here with uncomfortable precision. If a man knows not which port he sails for, no wind is favorable. The activity, however genuine, is not the same as direction. This pattern finds particularly fertile ground in the 30s. The pace of life at this stage, the career demands, the relationship commitments, the accumulating responsibilities, creates enough legitimate noise that drift can pass unnoticed for years. There is always a reasonable explanation for why the bigger financial questions haven't been addressed yet, and the social dimension adds its own complication. There is a quiet but persistent pressure at this age to appear settled, to project the kind of financial competence that suggests you have things organized. Honest self-assessment requires admitting that you don't. And that admission carries a social cost that makes avoidance feel like the more reasonable option. The result is that most people living inside this pattern never recognize it as a pattern. They develop alternative explanations. The market is difficult. The timing has been unfortunate. Money has never been their strong suit. These explanations are not entirely wrong, but they are incomplete in a way that keeps the real problem safely out of view. Because as long as the explanation points outward, to markets, to timing, to temperament, the structural gap at the center of the problem remains unexamined and therefore unchanged. Perhaps at some point in the last few minutes, something shifted slightly for you. A quiet recognition, not dramatic, not comfortable, of seeing your own experience described with a precision you weren't quite prepared for. That recognition is not a coincidence. It is what happens when the real problem is finally named accurately. And it matters because you cannot build what you cannot first see clearly. What you have been experiencing is not the result of who you are. It is the result of what hasn't been built yet. And those two things, once distinguished from each other, lead to entirely different places. There is a version of financial struggle that the world recognizes easily. It has visible markers, debt that has grown unmanageable, a lifestyle that clearly exceeds its means, decisions that announce their recklessness. That version of struggle is uncomfortable, but it carries a certain clarity. The problem is legible. The need for change is obvious. The direction, however difficult, is at least apparent. What you are likely carrying is something different, and in some ways harder to address precisely because it is harder to see. From the outside, everything looks fine. The income is respectable. The obligations are met. The lifestyle is reasonable, perhaps even comfortable. There is no obvious crisis, no moment of visible collapse that would signal to anyone, including yourself, that something is meaningfully wrong. And this is where the particular difficulty begins. Because when a problem has no external evidence, the only place it lives is inside. And an internal problem with no external confirmation is one of the loneliest things a person can carry. The internal experience, if you have the patience to examine it honestly, is one of fragmentation, not chaos, fragmentation. The subtle but persistent sense that your financial life is a collection of parts that have never been assembled into a coherent whole. There is a savings account here, an expense pattern there, an intention somewhere in the background that hasn't quite materialized into action. Each piece exists, but the pieces don't form a structure. And living inside a collection of parts, however individually reasonable, produces a specific kind of weariness. The weariness of someone who is perpetually managing rather than building, perpetually responding rather than directing. Over time, this fragmentation does something that most people don't anticipate. It doesn't stay financial. It migrates. It moves into confidence, into the quiet background hum of self-assessment that runs beneath daily life. It surfaces in small moments, when someone mentions their investment strategy at dinner, when a colleague discusses a property purchase with easy certainty, when you sit down to review your accounts and feel, beneath the numbers, that familiar hesitation. The hesitation is not confusion about the numbers. It is something older than that. It is the ongoing, unresolved question of whether you are the kind of person who has this together. And the honest answer, the one you would never say out loud, keeps arriving not as yes or no, but as a pause. Consider someone, and perhaps you recognize this person, who has spent several years meaning to get serious about money. Not reckless, not indifferent, genuinely intending, in a consistent and sincere way, to begin. After the next big project at work, after the move settles. Once the holidays pass and January brings a fresh start, the intention is real each time it appears. The circumstances always provide a reasonable justification for waiting just a little longer. And then, one day, without any dramatic event to mark the moment, this person looks up and does a quiet calculation, not of their net worth, but of time, and they realize that 5 years have passed inside the intention to begin. That the settling they were waiting for never came, and that the beginning, still waiting at the edge of whenever, has become its own kind of chronic condition. The cost of this is not poverty. It is not ruin. It is something subtler, and in its own way more difficult to reckon with. The compounding distance between where you are and where a slightly more structured version of yourself would have arrived by now. Not a dramatically different person, not someone with extraordinary income or unusual discipline, simply a version of you who started building 1 year earlier or 3 years earlier and allowed that structure to quietly accumulate over time. The gap between those two versions is not measured in wealth alone. It is measured in confidence, in options, in the quality of the choices available to you now versus the choices that would be available had the foundation been laid sooner. There is a particular gravity to sitting with this honestly. Not the sharp gravity of crisis, but the slow, heavy gravity of recognition, the feeling of understanding with new clarity that time has been moving steadily while structure has been waiting patiently for a more convenient moment to arrive. That moment, of course, never announces itself. Convenience is not how structure gets built. Structure gets built in the absence of perfect conditions, by people who have decided that the imperfect present is the only building site that will ever actually exist. And that realization, quiet, grounded, free of drama, is where something begins to change. Not because of panic, not because of urgency, but because the alternative, now seen clearly, is simply no longer acceptable. Not in a harsh way, in an honest one. The fog has been named, the cost has been counted, and somewhere beneath the recognition, the decision to build is already forming. At some point in every honest inquiry, the questions change, not because the situation has changed, but because the understanding has deepened enough to make the old questions obsolete. You have been asking, in various forms, some version of the same question for a while now. Why don't I feel more settled about money? Why hasn't the clarity arrived? Why does the gap between where I am and where I want to be remain so stubbornly present despite everything I have tried? These are reasonable questions, but they are built on an assumption that has been quietly limiting every answer you've been able to find. The assumption is that clarity is a feeling, something that arrives when enough conditions are met, when enough knowledge has been absorbed, when enough progress has accumulated to finally produce the sensation of being on solid ground. And if clarity is a feeling, then its absence is something you wait for, something you work toward emotionally, something that other people seem to have found, but that has so far eluded you. This assumption feels natural. It is also the reason the waiting never ends. The truth that reframes everything is this: financial clarity is not a feeling you arrive at. It is a structure you build. And the feeling, the steadiness, the confidence, the quiet sense of knowing where you stand follows the structure. It does not precede it. It is produced by it. This distinction, simple as it sounds, changes the entire nature of the problem. Because if clarity is something you build rather than something you feel your way toward, then its absence is no longer a mystery. It is simply a description of what hasn't been constructed yet. This shifts the question entirely. Instead of asking why you don't feel more confident about money, the more useful question becomes, what have I actually built, and what is still missing from the foundation? That is a question with edges. It points somewhere specific. It invites assessment rather than self-criticism, construction rather than performance. And it separates the problem cleanly from your identity, because a missing foundation is not a character flaw. It is simply an incomplete project. Consider what actually separates a financially reactive person from a financially grounded one. It is tempting to assume the difference is income, that the grounded person simply has more resources to work with, or intelligence, or some innate discipline that makes financial responsibility feel natural rather than effortful. But when you look closely at people who have genuine financial steadiness, the distinguishing factor is almost never any of those things. It is structure. It is the presence of an underlying architecture that gives their daily decisions coherence, that answers certain questions before they arise, that removes the need to rely on willpower in moments when willpower is in short supply. Motivation, examined honestly, behaves like weather. It arrives with genuine force. It shifts your mood, your energy, your sense of what is possible. And then it moves on, as weather does, leaving the landscape largely as it found it. The person who felt powerfully motivated to change their financial life after a difficult month is, 6 weeks later, usually back inside the same patterns. Not because they are weak, but because motivation was never designed to be a substitute for structure. Structure behaves differently. It behaves like geology, slow to form, unremarkable in the making, entirely invisible until it is finished. But once it exists, it shapes everything built above it, permanently and without requiring any ongoing emotional maintenance. Think about the practical difference this produces. One person feels inspired to save after a month that frightened them financially. Their saving that month is real. but it is powered by feeling, which means it is subject to the variability of feeling. It will be stronger in difficult months and weaker in comfortable ones. Another person has built a structure in which saving occurs automatically, independent of how they feel about money on any given Tuesday. Both people may care equally about their future. Only one has removed the emotional weather from the equation entirely. When you begin to see your financial life as an architectural project rather than an emotional experience, something subtle but significant shifts in the language you use to think about it. Willpower becomes design. Guilt becomes assessment. Confusion becomes diagnosis. These are not merely different words for the same thing. They are different orientations toward the same reality, and they produce genuinely different results. Willpower is depleting. Design is stable. Guilt is circular. Assessment points forward. Confusion feels personal. Diagnosis feels solvable. And in that shift of orientation, something becomes available that no amount of motivation ever produced. The quiet, grounded recognition that the problem was never about who you are. It was always about what hadn't been built yet, which means that what comes next is not self-improvement. It is construction. And construction, unlike self-improvement, has a beginning, a direction, and the capacity to produce something that stands on its own, regardless of how you feel on the day you build it. Understanding arrives before change. This is something most people get backwards. They wait to feel different before they act differently, not realizing that the feeling they are waiting for is actually produced by the acting, and more specifically, by the thinking that precedes the acting. The internal shift, when it finally comes, does not announce itself with dramatic force. It arrives quietly in the quality of a conversation you are having with yourself, a conversation that has been running for years and has, until now, been shaped almost entirely by a misdiagnosis. The first thing that changes is not your bank balance. It is not your savings rate or your investment strategy or any measurable external metric. The first thing that changes is the tone of that internal conversation. The self-critical loop, the one that has been quietly reinforcing the idea that your confusion reflects something fundamentally limited about you, begins to soften. Not because the problem has been solved, not because anything external has shifted, but because the problem has finally been named accurately. And there is something about accurate naming that removes the shame from a situation with remarkable efficiency. Shame requires ambiguity to survive. It thrives in the space between knowing something is wrong and not knowing why. Once the why is clear, the shame loses its footing. And in that small but significant loosening, identity begins to move. The person who carried the quiet conviction that they were simply not good with money, that this was a fixed truth about themselves, as immovable as height or temperament, begins to question whether that was ever actually true. They begin to trace the conclusion backward. Where did it come from? It came from repeated experiences of financial frustration. And where did those come from? From operating without a coherent structure. And is the absence of a structure a personal flaw, or is it simply an absence? Something that was never built, rather than something that cannot be built? The answer, examined honestly, is always the latter. The belief was never a truth about the person. It was a conclusion drawn from a structural problem and, through years of repetition, mistakenly assigned to identity. When that reassignment is reversed, the posture changes. The defensive crouch that financial conversations used to require begins to open. Avoidance, which was always a form of self-protection against a problem that felt personal and therefore threatening, starts to give way to something more like curiosity. Assessment becomes possible where before there was only management, and the exhausting work of maintaining a confused financial life. The constant low-level energy required to justify individual decisions, to manage the anxiety of incoherence, to explain to yourself why things are the way they are, begins to quiet down, replaced by something considerably less draining: the focused, patient work of building. This is not the transformation that motivation promises. Motivation promises a dramatic overhaul, a complete restructuring, a new person emerging from a single, powerful decision. That version of change is compelling and almost entirely unreliable because it depends on a sustained emotional state that no one can maintain indefinitely. The transformation that actually holds is far less cinematic. It is the unglamorous, incremental act of placing one structural element deliberately, then another, then another. It does not feel like a breakthrough while it is happening. It feels like ordinary work. But ordinary work, done inside a coherent structure, compounds in ways that inspired effort never does. One of the most tangible signs of this internal shift is a change in the questions you bring to financial decisions. The old question, the one that governed most decisions before the shift, was some version of, "Can I afford this?" That question is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that keeps financial life permanently reactive. It evaluates each decision in isolation against a single variable without reference to anything larger. The new question is different in kind, not just degree. Where does this fit in what I am building? That question assumes the existence of a structure. It positions every decision within a framework rather than in a vacuum. And it produces, over time, a coherence that no amount of financial content, no budget template, no moment of inspiration ever managed to create, because it changes not just what you decide, but the basis on which you decide. James Clear observed that every action is a vote for the kind of person you want to become. What shifts internally at this stage is that you begin casting votes for a different identity. Not the person who is trying to be better with money, but the person who is building something deliberate and structured with it. The difference between those two identities is not subtle. One is in a permanent state of becoming. The other is already, quietly, in a state of construction. And what emerges from that construction is not the loud, declarative confidence of someone who has arrived at a destination. It is the steadier, more durable confidence of someone who knows which direction they are facing and who understands that facing the right direction consistently is how every worthwhile thing eventually gets built. There is a particular moment that follows genuine insight, not the moment of the insight itself, but the quieter moment after, when the mind returns to ordinary life and begins to see familiar things differently. The commute, the grocery store, the end-of-month account review. Nothing external has changed. And yet, something in the way these ordinary moments register has shifted because the framework through which you are interpreting them is no longer the same. This is where understanding becomes practical, not through a list of new actions, but through a changed quality of attention. Small decisions begin to feel different under this new attention, not because the amounts involved have grown more significant, but because they now exist within a context that gives them meaning beyond their immediate dollar value. A spending choice that once would have been evaluated in isolation, is this reasonable? Is this something I can justify? Now arrives inside a larger question, not a constraining question, a orienting one. Where does this fit in what I am building? That shift in framing seems minor until you live with it for a few weeks and notice that it quietly reorganizes the way dozens of small decisions accumulate. Individual choices that used to float free of one another begin to form a pattern. And the pattern, for the first time, is one you are directing rather than one that is simply emerging. The old habit of evaluating each financial choice in isolation was not careless. It was the logical response to operating without architecture. When there is no larger structure to reference, the only available standard is the individual decision itself. Is this affordable? Is this responsible? Is this what a sensible person would do? These questions are not wrong, but they are insufficient in the same way that checking whether each brick is solid tells you nothing about whether the building is sound. Structural integrity is a property of the whole, not the sum of isolated assessments of parts. Once you have a whole to reference, the questions change, and the decisions that follow from them carry a different quality of coherence. One of the most quietly powerful shifts that practical alignment produces is the dissolution of a particular illusion, one that most people have been carrying so long it no longer feels like an illusion at all. It is the belief that financial clarity is waiting somewhere ahead, that it will arrive with the next raise, or when the debt is finally cleared, or when life settles into a less demanding season and there is finally time and space to get organized. This belief is remarkably persistent because it always has a plausible next version of itself. The next milestone is always visible. The settling always seems genuinely close. And so the structure never gets built, because building it is always being reasonably deferred in favor of circumstances that will make building it easier. The clarity this illusion promises has never arrived through circumstances, and it never will. Circumstances do not deliver structure, they respond to it. The people who feel financially grounded did not reach a moment when life became simple enough to get organized. They built a structure beside the complexity, and the structure is what made the complexity manageable. Waiting for the right moment to begin is simply drift with a more optimistic self-narrative. The related illusion, perhaps even more stubborn, is that more income is the solution. That the confusion is essentially a resource problem, and that when the resources are sufficient, the clarity will follow naturally. But more income flowing through an unstructured system does not produce clarity. It produces more confusion at a higher volume, with higher stakes and less margin for error. The structure has to come first. Income is material, but material without architecture is not a building. It is a pile. The two are not interchangeable, and treating them as if they are is one of the most expensive misunderstandings a person can carry through their 30s. The same reframing applies to discipline. The conventional belief is that financial improvement is fundamentally a discipline problem, that the gap between where you are and where you want to be would close if you simply applied more consistent willpower to the right behaviors. But a well-designed structure requires dramatically less discipline than an unstructured life, because it removes the need to make the same decisions repeatedly. Discipline is a finite resource. Design is not. A system that automates your savings does not ask anything of your willpower. It simply works on the days when you are focused and the days when you are not, in the months when you feel motivated and the months when you don't. The practical implication of all of this is not a set of instructions. It is a reorientation from reactive management to deliberate construction, from responding to money to designing with it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. The financial equivalent is this: you have power over your structure, not over your circumstances. And structure, built patiently and consistently, compounds in ways that even the most energetic sporadic effort never manages to approach. Nothing about this is urgent. Everything about it is important. And understanding the difference between those two things, sitting with the importance without manufacturing the urgency, is itself a form of maturity that most financial advice never pauses long enough to teach. Return for a moment to where this began. There was a person who arrived at the beginning of this with a particular kind of weight, not the weight of obvious failure or visible crisis, but something quieter and in some ways more difficult, the weight of unresolved competence. Someone who had done most things reasonably well, who had applied genuine effort and genuine intelligence to their financial life, and who still arrived each month at the same low, persistent uncertainty. Someone carrying a confusion they could not name, and a shame they could not quite justify releasing, because nothing dramatic enough had happened to explain either one. That person was not lacking effort. They were not lacking intelligence or care, or the sincere desire to do better. What they were lacking was something no one had ever clearly identified for them, something the financial content industry rarely pauses to address, something that sits beneath all the tactics and strategies and frameworks that get offered in its place. They were lacking architecture. And without architecture, even the most capable person experiences the same inevitable result: motion without direction, decisions without coherence, a financial life that functions more or less, but never quite accumulates into anything that feels solid and intentional and built. This is not a harsh assessment. It is simply an accurate one. And accuracy, as we have moved through this together, is the thing that makes change possible in a way that inspiration alone never does. What has happened across these sections is not merely a series of ideas presented in sequence. It is the gradual assembly of a single, coherent picture, one in which philosophy, emotion, and behavior are no longer three separate conversations, but one unified understanding. The philosophical truth is that structure precedes clarity, not the other way around. The emotional truth is that the shame and fragmentation you have been carrying were responses to a structural gap, not evidence of personal limitation. And the behavioral truth is that once you understand this, the decisions you make, small and large, begin to carry a different quality of intention, because they are no longer floating free in isolation, but exist within a framework you are consciously constructing. These three truths, held together, resolve the confusion that brought you here, not by eliminating complexity, but by giving you an accurate way to interpret it. Confusion, seen through this lens, is no longer a verdict. It is a signal. And structural signals are among the most useful signals a person can receive, because they point not to who you are, but to what still needs to be built. The direction they offer is not backward, into self-criticism, but forward, into construction. Perhaps the single most important thing to carry from everything explored here is this: you do not need to feel ready before you build. The readiness you have been waiting for, the sense of clarity and confidence that would finally make it feel safe to begin, is not the precondition for building. It is the product of it. Clarity does not arrive and then make structure possible. Structure is built imperfectly and incrementally, and clarity is what that structure eventually produces. Reversing that sequence, waiting to feel ready before acting, is the mechanism by which years pass inside the intention to begin. Growth that emerges from this understanding has a noticeably different quality than growth driven by motivation or guilt or the temporary energy of a difficult month. It is quieter. It is less dependent on mood, on market conditions, on the particular circumstances of any given season. It does not require you to feel inspired on a Tuesday morning to continue moving in the right direction. It continues because it is built into the structure of how your financial life is organized, not because you are managing your emotional state carefully enough to keep producing the right behaviors. And it is irreversible in the way that all genuine understanding is irreversible. You cannot unknow what you now know about the relationship between structure and clarity. You cannot return to believing that the next piece of information will finally produce the stability you have been looking for. You cannot unsee the architectural gap for what it is, not a reflection of your limitations, but a description of something unbuilt. And that inability to unsee it is, quietly, the most reliable engine of lasting change that exists. Not because it creates urgency, but because it makes a certain kind of comfortable stagnation permanently unavailable. The person who has reached this point in the journey is not dramatically different from the person who arrived at the beginning. The income is the same. The circumstances are the same. The challenges that exist in daily financial life are largely the same. But something fundamental has shifted in the orientation, in the way the problem is perceived, in the language available to think about it, in the quality of the questions being brought to it. That person is now building. Quietly, without fanfare, without waiting for the conditions to improve, or the motivation to arrive, or the right moment to finally present itself. Just building. And that, it turns out, was always the whole point. There is a particular kind of relief that has nothing to do with solving a problem. It is quieter than that, and in some ways, more valuable. The relief that comes simply from understanding what the problem actually is. From finally having a name for something that has been present, without a name, for longer than you realized. When that naming happens, something loosens. Not dramatically. Not with the rush of a breakthrough or the clarity of a sudden revelation, but with the slow, settling quality of tension that has been held for so long, it had begun to feel like a natural part of the body, and then, one day, is simply no longer there. You may be feeling something like that now, a loosening of something you were carrying more tightly than you knew. The anxiety that surrounded money, the low hum that accompanied account reviews and financial conversations and end-of-month reckonings, was never really about money in the way you assumed it was. It was about uncertainty, about the particular discomfort of not knowing where you stood, of facing a direction without being confident it was the right one, of making decisions without a framework that could tell you whether they were moving you towards something or simply away from discomfort. Money was the surface. Uncertainty was what lived beneath it. And uncertainty, sustained long enough without a fixed point of reference, produces exactly the kind of ambient anxiety that no raise, no financial tip, and no moment of inspiration was ever going to resolve. Structure does not eliminate uncertainty. Nothing does. The future remains genuinely unknown. Markets remain genuinely unpredictable, and life continues to produce circumstances that no plan fully anticipates. But structure gives you something that uncertainty alone never can: a fixed point from which to navigate, a place to stand while the conditions shift around you. And the difference between a person navigating from a fixed point and a person drifting through uncertainty without one is not a difference in the uncertainty they face. It is a difference in their relationship to it. One is subject to the weather. The other has a shelter. Patience arrives differently once you are building. This is something that is difficult to understand in advance, but becomes immediately obvious once experienced. When you are waiting for clarity to arrive, waiting for the feeling of readiness, the right conditions, the sufficient accumulation of knowledge, patience feels like suspension, like being held in place against your will, watching time without you. But when you are building, patience changes character entirely. It becomes something active rather than passive, the steady, quiet confidence of someone who understands that the work being done today is producing something, even when that something is not yet visible. Building is its own form of forward motion. It does not require external confirmation to feel like progress. It simply requires that you continue. There is a composure available to the person who has genuinely internalized this, a quality of steadiness that is distinct from either confidence or contentment. It is the composure of someone who can sit with incompleteness without being destabilized by it, who can look at a financial life that is still in the early or middle stages of construction and feel neither shame about what isn't finished nor impatience for what hasn't yet arrived. The work is underway, and underway, it turns out, is enough, not as a consolation, but as a genuine and sufficient truth. Underway means direction. Underway means intention made tangible. Underway is the only form progress has ever actually taken for anyone who has ever built anything worth having. Maturity around money, real maturity, the kind that produces lasting steadiness rather than periodic inspiration, is not knowing all the answers. It is knowing which questions deserve your consistent attention and returning to them with curiosity rather than dread. It is the capacity to assess without judgment, to adjust without drama, to continue without requiring the work to feel heroic. These are quiet capacities. They do not announce themselves, but they are the ones that compound most reliably over time because they do not depend on circumstances being favorable or emotions being cooperative. Time changes when you begin to build with it. What once felt like an adversary, something running out, something other people were using more wisely, something that was accumulating against you rather than for you, begins to feel like what it actually is, a resource, patient, indifferent, available in equal measure to anyone willing to work with it rather than wait for it. Every day inside a structure is a day the structure is doing something on your behalf, quietly and without fanfare, in the background of ordinary life. This is the resolution that no motivational speech can produce, because it cannot be manufactured by enthusiasm. It can only be arrived at through honest examination, accurate diagnosis, and the gradual accumulation of understanding that has happened across everything explored here. Not the high of inspiration, not the sharp clarity of a single insight, but the low, steady, durable warmth of a person who knows where they are, knows which direction they are building, and has stopped waiting for permission to begin. That warmth, once found, does not leave easily. There is a particular kind of truth that doesn't announce itself with complexity. It arrives simply, almost plainly, and it is precisely that plainness that gives it weight. After everything examined here, the confusion, the misdiagnosis, the invisible pattern, the emotional cost, the reframing, the shift, the integration, what remains is something that could be stated in a single sentence, and yet contains within it the answer to years of quiet frustration. Financial confusion is almost never about money. It is about the absence of the structure within which money can find meaning and direction. That is the whole of it. Everything else, the tactics, the strategies, the frameworks, the content consumed across years of genuine effort, was always downstream of this. And because the structure was missing, the downstream efforts kept producing the same result: temporary clarity that faded, motivation that didn't hold, progress that accumulated without cohering into anything stable. Not because the efforts were wrong, because they were being applied to the wrong level of the problem. This is worth sitting with, because it has implications that extend well beyond the financial. The pattern described throughout this audiobook, awareness without architecture, knowledge without construction, intelligence without design, is not unique to money. It appears wherever capable people have invested heavily in understanding something and lightly in building something. It appears in careers that stall not from lack of talent, but from lack of deliberate structure. In relationships that drift not from lack of care, but from lack of intentional design. In creative work that never quite materializes, not from lack of ideas, but from lack of a framework that transforms ideas into finished things. In any domain of life, Awareness without architecture produces the same quiet result: well-intentioned drift. People who know a great deal and build very little. People who are perpetually on the edge of the life they are capable of without ever quite stepping into it. The principle, once seen, cannot be unseen. And once you begin to look for the architectural gaps in your life, not just the financial ones, you will find that the same clarifying question applies everywhere. What have I actually built here, and what is still missing from the foundation? Perhaps the most quietly liberating realization in all of this is one that deserves to be stated directly without qualification. You were never behind. The feeling of being behind, of having lost ground to better prepared versions of other people, of having squandered time that cannot be recovered, of arriving at 30 or 35 or 40 with less to show for it than you expected, that feeling was real. But its diagnosis was wrong. You were not behind because you were inadequate. You were building in the wrong order. You were attempting to achieve clarity before structure, confidence before foundation, peace before design. And that sequence, however intuitive it feels, simply does not work. Clarity does not come first and then make building possible. Building comes first and then makes clarity inevitable. Reverse the sequence, and the entire experience of financial life changes. Not the circumstances, those shift slowly, over time, as structure compounds. But the internal experience changes almost immediately, because you are no longer waiting for a feeling that can only be produced by something you haven't yet built. You are building. And building, as we have established, is its own form of forward motion, one that does not require external validation, favorable conditions, or emotional readiness to continue producing results. There is one final thing worth saying, and it is the simplest thing of all. A life well-structured is not a life controlled. This is a misunderstanding worth correcting, because it is the one that keeps many thoughtful people at arm's length from the very thing that would free them. Structure is not constraint. A well-designed financial architecture does not narrow the options available to you. It expands them. It does not reduce your freedom. It is the precondition for it. The person without structure is not free. They are subject to every fluctuation of circumstance, every shift in market or mood, every unexpected demand on resources that have no designated place. They are reactive by necessity because they have built nothing that would allow them to be otherwise. The person with structure moves differently, not rigidly, not without flexibility or spontaneity or the capacity to respond to life as it actually arrives, but from a foundation that holds, regardless of what is happening above it. From a design that continues to work on their behalf even when their attention is elsewhere. From a clarity that was never waiting to be found. It was always waiting to be built. Morgan Housel wrote that the goal of investing is not to maximize returns. It is to earn returns you can actually live with. The goal of financial architecture is something similar. Not to optimize every variable, but to build something coherent enough that your life can finally move in the direction it was always capable of going. That direction has been there the whole time. The structure is simply what allows you to follow it.